In the summer of 1768, long before the word freedom would thunder across American soil, a 9-year-old boy stood barefoot on the edge of a West African river and watched the world he understood disappear into smoke. His name was Josiah. At least, that was the name he would later be forced to answer to. On that night, under a sky bruised purple by firelight, he had another name, spoken softly by his mother as she pulled him close and whispered that no matter what happened, he must remember who he was. Before dawn, men armed with muskets and iron restraints shattered that promise. They came with practiced efficiency, traders working alongside local raiders, feeding the machinery of an empire that thrived on human cargo. Villages burned, not because of hatred, but because of profit. The boy saw his father fall while defending the doorway of their home. He saw his mother dragged away in a different direction. He screamed until his throat felt flayed raw, but no one answered. The chains were colder than the river water, and when they locked around his wrists, he felt the first fracture inside his chest, the invisible kind that never heals clean. Weeks later, the Atlantic swallowed him. The slave ship groaned like a dying animal as it cut through black water. Bodies were stacked in suffocating darkness beneath the deck, where the air soured quickly and hope rotted even faster. British merchants kept careful ledgers above deck, recording weight, age, and projected sale value with clinical precision. Beneath their boots, children trembled in filth and fever. Josiah learned quickly that tears brought punishment and silence brought survival. He stopped speaking altogether. When the ship finally docked in Charleston, South Carolina, sunlight felt foreign against his skin. Buyers inspected him as though examining livestock, prying open his mouth to check his teeth, pressing fingers into his arms to measure strength he had not yet grown into. A plantation owner with a powdered wig and a voice as dry as parchment purchased him without asking his name. That detail did not matter. Names could not be harvested like cotton. The plantation stretched endlessly, rows of white fiber glowing under the southern sun like a false promise. On his first morning in the fields, he watched an overseer lash a grown man for collapsing from heat exhaustion. The crack of the whip sliced through the humid air and lodged itself somewhere permanent inside his memory. At 9 years old, Josiah understood something that would shape the rest of his life. The land was beautiful, and the system built upon it was merciless. That evening, as cicadas hummed and darkness crept across the fields, he stared at the stars and tried to remember the sound of his mother's voice. The effort hurt more than the bruises forming across his back.
Somewhere beyond that horizon, she might still be alive. Somewhere beyond that sky, justice might exist. But on that plantation, under British colonial authority in American soil, only survival had meaning. And before the next sunrise, he would learn just how much survival was going to cost him. If this story moves you, make sure you subscribe to Canon of Darkness, because what happened next did not just shape a boy, it began shaping a nation that would one day be forced to answer for its sins. By the time the first frost touched the Carolina fields, Josiah understood that the plantation ran less on cruelty than on calculation. Every sunrise began with numbers, and every sunset ended with numbers, because the men who controlled the land believed that arithmetic justified anything. The overseer carried a leather-bound ledger tucked beneath his arm as faithfully as a preacher carried scripture, and inside those pages were entries that reduced living souls to figures beside neat columns of ink. Josiah watched his own body become an investment, a projected return measured in cotton weight and years of labor, and he felt something inside him harden in a way that no child should ever experience. The plantation owner, a British-born merchant who had inherited both wealth and entitlement, rarely dirtied his boots in the fields. He preferred the porch of the grand house, where sweet tea sweated in crystal glasses and conversations revolved around shipments, tariffs, and the rising tensions between the colonies and the crown. The irony of men debating liberty while enslaved children bent beneath sacks of cotton did not trouble him in the slightest. Josiah noticed that contradiction long before he understood its political meaning, because he could see clearly that freedom was a word spoken loudly and practiced selectively. Work intensified as the harvest season approached. From dawn until the sun dipped low and painted the sky in molten orange, Josiah's small hands moved through thorny cotton bolls that sliced his fingertips until they bled. The overseer rode along the rows on horseback, his eyes scanning for hesitation, his whip coiled loosely as though it were simply another tool of agriculture. Whenever a worker's sack appeared too light, punishment followed swiftly and publicly, because fear was more efficient when shared. One afternoon, Josiah stumbled beneath the weight of his load and dropped to one knee. The sack split open, spilling white fiber across the dirt like scattered clouds. The overseer dismounted without urgency, as though savoring the moment, and demanded that the boy stand tall enough to receive correction. Josiah rose, not because he was unhurt, but because he had already learned that visible weakness invited prolonged suffering. The lash struck with a sound that echoed beyond the fields and into the quarters where other enslaved families listened in helpless silence. That night, an older man named Elijah pressed a cool cloth against Josiah's torn skin and spoke in a low, steady voice about endurance. He explained that survival required more than strength, it required memory, because the system thrived when it erased origins and replaced them with obedience. Josiah tried to remember the river from his childhood and the rhythm of drums that once carried across his village, yet the details blurred like ink washed by rain. As he lay awake on the rough wooden floor, staring through a crack in the wall at a sliver of moonlight, he sensed that something larger was shifting beyond the plantation gates. Whispers about unrest in Boston and rebellion against British authority drifted even into the quarters, carried by passing traders and nervous plantation hands.
Josiah did not yet understand that the same empire claiming divine order over him was beginning to fracture elsewhere. By morning, he would discover that the fracture in the empire was about to collide violently with the fracture inside his own life. The rumors did not arrive like thunder. They slipped onto the plantation like fog rolling in from the marshes, quiet but impossible to ignore, and Josiah first sensed their weight in the uneasy tone of the white men gathered on the veranda. Merchants who once spoke confidently about royal protection now argued in sharper voices about taxes, representation, and the arrogance of a distant king. Words such as liberty and rights floated across the yard, while enslaved men and women carried trays of food and pretended not to listen, even though those words struck them with a bitter irony that burned far deeper than the Carolina sun. Josiah had grown taller in the months since his arrival, though the growth came from labor rather than childhood. His shoulders had begun to broaden, and the overseer now expected more cotton from him than before, as though suffering accelerated maturity. One evening, while delivering water to the main house, he paused outside an open window where the plantation owner entertained two visiting traders recently arrived from Charleston. Their conversation was thick with tension. The colonies, they said, were restless, and British authority felt less secure with every passing shipment. Talk of rebellion stirred in the north, and some whispered that war might follow. The owner scoffed at the notion that farmers and merchants could challenge an empire that spanned oceans, yet he also tightened his grip on every asset he possessed, including the human beings whose labor financed his lifestyle. Josiah sensed that fear in the way the overseer's punishments became harsher, as though discipline on the plantation might somehow compensate for uncertainty in Parliament. Whenever unrest threatened white power, it was black bodies that absorbed the anxiety. Within the slave quarters, the whispers carried a different tone. Elijah spoke cautiously of a rumor spreading among enslaved communities that the British Crown might promise freedom to those who escaped colonial masters and pledged loyalty to the king. The possibility sounded both dangerous and intoxicating because it suggested that the same empire responsible for transporting them across the Atlantic might exploit colonial rebellion by turning bondage into a bargaining chip. Josiah struggled to comprehend how freedom could be offered as strategy rather than justice, yet the idea lodged in his heart like a fragile ember. Days later, a rider arrived at the plantation bearing official news from Charleston. The colonies were indeed spiraling toward conflict, and militias were organizing in response to escalating confrontations in the north. The plantation owner gathered his household and declared that loyalty to Britain would preserve order, while treason would invite chaos. Josiah watched the man's face closely and realized that for the first time since his capture, the owner looked uncertain. That night, as the quarters buzzed with restless speculation, Elijah leaned close to Josiah and spoke in a voice barely louder than breath, explaining that wars between powerful men often opened cracks in systems that once seemed unbreakable. Josiah lay awake long after the others slept, staring into darkness and imagining what a crack in this system might look like. He did not yet know whether it would lead to deliverance or devastation, but he sensed with growing intensity that the approaching war would force him to choose between two masters who both claimed authority over his fate. By sunrise, the choice would no longer feel distant or theoretical, because someone on that plantation was already planning an escape that would change everything. Before the week ended, the fragile rumors that had drifted through the quarters hardened into something far more dangerous, and Josiah realized that the crack Elijah had spoken of was no longer theoretical, but widening with every passing day. News traveled quietly from plantation to plantation that Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, had issued a proclamation promising freedom to enslaved men willing to escape rebel masters and fight for the British Crown. The offer carried the sharp edge of manipulation, yet for those whose lives had been defined by chains, even a calculated promise of liberty felt like oxygen after years of suffocation. Elijah gathered a small circle inside the dimly lit quarters and spoke with careful urgency about what the proclamation meant. He explained that the British were not motivated by compassion, but by strategy, seeking to weaken colonial rebellion by turning enslaved labor into military leverage. Josiah listened as older men debated the risks with grave intensity, because capture during an attempted escape would guarantee brutal retaliation, while successful flight might deliver them into the uncertainty of war. The plantation owner had already increased patrols along the riverbanks, fearing that his workforce might evaporate under cover of darkness. Josiah wrestled with the contradiction twisting inside him. The same empire that had torn him from his homeland was now offering a path out of bondage, yet that path required allegiance to the very crown whose merchants had profited from his suffering. He struggled to determine whether accepting such an offer meant betraying something sacred within himself, or whether survival demanded embracing any door that opened, regardless of who held the key. Elijah argued that freedom secured through war might still be freedom, even if born from political convenience rather than moral awakening. Tension on the plantation thickened as whispers of escape attempts in neighboring counties reached the overseer's ears. Punishments intensified, curfews tightened, and armed men began patrolling the fields after sunset. Josiah noticed that fear now lived on both sides of the color line. because rebellion threatened not only British authority, but also the entire structure of colonial slavery. The owner's once confident demeanor had shifted into brittle vigilance, as though he sensed that the system supporting his wealth might fracture under the strain of revolution.
One humid night, Elijah pulled Josiah aside and revealed that a group intended to flee within days, using the river as their guide toward British lines rumored to be forming along the coast. He asked whether the boy was willing to risk everything for a promise that might dissolve under gunfire. Josiah felt the weight of that question settle across his chest, because staying guaranteed continued bondage, while leaving promised only uncertainty and the possibility of death. As the moon climbed high above the cotton fields, Josiah stood alone near the edge of the property and listened to the distant croak of frogs along the marsh. He imagined his mother's voice urging him to remember who he was, and he wondered whether that memory required action rather than endurance. By dawn, the decision would no longer belong solely to him, because the overseer had begun suspecting that someone on the plantation was preparing to run, and suspicion on such land often led to irreversible consequences. The night of the escape arrived without ceremony, yet the air itself seemed charged with consequence, and Josiah felt the strong rehook of fate pulling him toward a decision that would divide his life into before and after. The plantation slept under a thin veil of moonlight, while armed patrols circled the perimeter with heightened vigilance, because rumors of flight had unsettled every white household in the county. Elijah moved through the quarters with controlled urgency, signaling to the small group who had pledged to risk everything for the fragile promise whispered in Lord Dunmore's proclamation. Josiah's heart pounded with such intensity that he feared the sound alone might expose them. He carried no possessions beyond the memory of his mother's voice and the quiet resolve that remaining would guarantee a lifetime measured in cotton weights and lash marks. The group slipped beyond the edge of the fields and into the dense thicket lining the riverbank, navigating by starlight and instinct. Each step through the marsh felt like defiance carved into the soil, yet each rustle of brush threatened to summon gunfire from riders who understood that enslaved labor was the foundation of their wealth. They reached the river just as clouds swallowed the moon, plunging the water into darkness so complete that it seemed bottomless. Elijah had arranged for a small skiff hidden among reeds, but retrieving it required wading into chest-deep water thick with mud and unseen currents. Josiah followed closely, suppressing the tremor in his limbs as cold water soaked his clothes and tightened around his ribs. Freedom lay somewhere beyond the opposite shore, yet the river itself felt like a living barrier, determined to test their resolve. Halfway across, a distant shout fractured the silence. A lantern flared along the bank they had just left, and the unmistakable crack of a musket echoed across the water. Panic surged through the group as bullets tore into the surface around them, sending violent sprays into the night air. One man cried out and disappeared beneath the current, his struggle swallowed by darkness before anyone could reach him. Josiah clung to the edge of the skiff, while Elijah rowed with desperate strength, knowing that hesitation would mean capture and punishment designed to terrify anyone who dared attempt escape again.
When they finally collapsed onto the far shore, lungs burning and bodies trembling, the realization of survival felt surreal rather than triumphant. They had crossed a physical boundary, yet the promise of safety remained uncertain because British lines were still miles away through hostile terrain. Behind them, the plantation owner would already be calculating losses and organizing pursuit, unwilling to surrender what he considered property without a fight. As dawn began to stain the horizon with pale light, Josiah looked back across the river that had nearly claimed his life and understood that there could be no return to the boy who once bent quietly beneath cotton sacks. Whatever awaited them within British ranks would demand another transformation, and the cost of that transformation would soon reveal itself in ways none of them yet imagined. By the second day of their journey, exhaustion pressed down on Josiah with a weight that rivaled the chains he had once worn. Yet the strong hook driving him forward was no longer fear of punishment, but the fragile possibility that his life might finally belong to him. The road toward British lines cut through swamps and pine forests scarred by the early tremors of revolution, and every distant gunshot reminded them that this land was unraveling under competing claims of liberty. Elijah pushed the group onward with steady determination, aware that hesitation would invite capture by colonial patrols, eager to make examples of fugitives. They reached a British encampment near the coast just before dusk, where rows of tents fluttered beneath the Union flag and red-coated soldiers moved with disciplined efficiency. An officer received them not with warmth, but with appraisal, scanning their bodies as though assessing military supplies rather than human beings seeking refuge. The proclamation promising freedom had indeed been issued, yet it came with conditions that were stated plainly. Able-bodied men would serve the crown, and loyalty would be measured in obedience on the battlefield. Josiah understood immediately that emancipation was being offered in exchange for risk, not granted as recognition of inherent worth.
Within days, he found himself wearing a coarse uniform that hung awkwardly across his narrow shoulders, the fabric stiff and foreign against skin long accustomed to plantation rags. The irony cut deep as he realized that he was now fighting for the same empire whose merchants had facilitated his capture. Yet survival often required navigating contradictions that defied simple morality. British officers drilled newly arrived black recruits relentlessly, emphasizing discipline and endurance, while promising that victory would secure their freedom permanently. The camp buzzed with rumors that thousands of enslaved men across the colonies were making similar journeys, transforming the war into something far more complex than a struggle between Parliament and colonial assemblies. Josiah's first encounter with battle came abruptly. Rebel militia advanced through marshland at dawn, their muskets flashing through morning mist as British cannons answered with thunderous force. Chaos consumed the field as smoke thickened the air and commands dissolved into frantic shouts. Josiah gripped his weapon with trembling hands, aware that firing upon colonial forces meant severing any lingering connection to the soil where he had labored in bondage. He moved forward because retreat would erase the promise that had drawn him across the river. Yet each step carried the weight of uncertainty about whether the Crown would honor its word once the war's outcome became clear. When the fighting subsided, the ground lay strewn with bodies clad in both red and homespun gray, and Josiah stood amid the aftermath with a sobering realization. Freedom purchased through blood would never feel clean, and allegiance to the British did not guarantee protection from prejudice within their own ranks. Some officers treated black soldiers with wary respect, while others viewed them as expendable tools in a larger imperial strategy. As night settled over the encampment, Josiah stared into the flames of a campfire and sensed that another reckoning loomed ahead. The war was intensifying, and whispers circulated that colonial forces were gaining strength in the north. If the Crown faltered, those who had wagered their futures on British promises would find themselves exposed in ways far more perilous than before. The war did not unfold in a straight line, and with every passing month, Josiah felt the strong rehook of uncertainty tightening around his future, because the promise of freedom now depended entirely on which flag would still be standing when the smoke cleared. British forces scored victories along the southern coast, yet reports from the north carried troubling news of colonial resilience. Around campfires, soldiers argued over strategy, while newly freed black recruits listened with guarded expressions, understanding that their liberty had become entangled in a conflict that was shifting faster than anyone anticipated. Josiah continued drilling with disciplined focus, determined to prove his worth not only as a soldier, but as a man deserving of autonomy. The uniform no longer felt foreign against his skin, yet acceptance within the ranks remained uneven. Some British officers praised the courage displayed by black regiments, acknowledging their critical role in maintaining manpower. Others treated them as temporary assets, avoiding any conversation about what would happen if the colonies succeeded in their rebellion. That silence unsettled Josiah more than open hostility, because unspoken doubts suggested that the Crown's proclamation might dissolve if circumstances demanded compromise. During a campaign near Savannah, Josiah witnessed both valor and vulnerability. British cannons roared against fortified rebel positions, while infantry advanced through dense terrain where visibility vanished in swirling smoke. He moved beside Elijah, whose steady presence had become an anchor amid chaos. When musket fire erupted from hidden lines, Elijah was struck in the shoulder and collapsed into damp grass, his face tightening with pain that he refused to vocalize. Josiah dragged him to relative safety, pressing cloth against the wound while medics navigated the battlefield with frantic urgency. In that moment, the war ceased to feel like politics and became a deeply personal reckoning with mortality. Elijah survived the injury, yet the brush with death altered him. As he recovered within the encampment, he spoke quietly about the fragile nature of alliances built on convenience rather than conviction. He warned Josiah that empires rarely acted out of compassion, and that freedom granted by decree could be revoked by treaty. Rumors began circulating that negotiations might eventually end the conflict, and some whispered that enslaved people who had fled to British lines could be returned to former masters as bargaining chips in a broader settlement. Josiah felt the weight of those rumors pressing against his chest like invisible chains. He had crossed a river, endured gunfire, and risked his life on the battlefield under the belief that the Crown's word would secure his independence. The possibility that political compromise could erase that sacrifice felt like betrayal layered upon betrayal. Yet he also understood that retreat was impossible, because returning to the plantation would mean surrendering not only his freedom, but his dignity. As autumn winds swept through the encampment and leaves scattered across trampled ground, a courier arrived with dispatches hinting at significant developments in the north. The message sparked hushed conversations among officers and restless anticipation among the ranks. Josiah sensed instinctively that whatever news those papers carried would determine whether his gamble on the British promise would be vindicated or shattered beyond repair. When the dispatches were finally read aloud beneath the dim lantern light of the officer's tent, Josiah felt the strong rehook of destiny shift beneath his feet, because the news confirmed what many had feared but few had dared to voice. British forces had suffered significant setbacks in the north, and colonial troops under determined leadership were gaining ground with alarming consistency. The war that once seemed like a calculated imperial response was beginning to tilt toward a revolutionary victory, and every black soldier who had wagered his freedom on the Crown understood that the stakes had just grown far more dangerous. The encampment's atmosphere transformed overnight.
Officers who had once spoken confidently about crushing rebellion now studied maps with furrowed brows and hushed urgency. Supplies grew inconsistent, reinforcements arrived sporadically, and rumors of French involvement in support of the colonists added another layer of uncertainty.
Josiah watched seasoned redcoats exchange uneasy glances, aware that alliances across oceans were reshaping the battlefield in ways that threatened British dominance. For men like him, whose liberation existed only within the framework of British success, each colonial victory felt like a step closer to potential re-enslavement. Elijah, still recovering from his wound, spoke soberly about contingency plans. He had begun quietly gathering information from sympathetic sailors who hinted that if the British were forced to evacuate major ports, black loyalists might be transported to other territories within the empire rather than abandoned. The idea of boarding another ship stirred painful memories in Josiah, yet the prospect of remaining in a victorious rebel America terrified him even more. Colonial leaders spoke passionately about liberty and self-governance, yet their vision of freedom rarely included those who had been enslaved. As winter approached, fighting intensified near Yorktown. Reports filtered through camp that General George Washington's forces were tightening their grip alongside French allies, creating a siege that could determine the war's outcome. Josiah felt history compressing into a single suffocating moment. He had survived the plantation, crossed the river under gunfire, and stood firm on battlefields scarred by cannon fire, yet none of those trials guaranteed that the promise made to him would survive political reality. One evening, as cold wind rattled the tent flaps and distant artillery echoed like approaching thunder, a British officer gathered the Black Regiment and addressed them with forced composure. He assured them that the Crown would honor its commitments regardless of the war's resolution, yet his voice carried a strain that betrayed uncertainty. Josiah studied the faces around him and saw the same question reflected in every pair of eyes. What becomes of men who fight for a losing side when their former masters are waiting to reclaim them? As dawn broke over frost-covered ground, a rider arrived at full gallop, bearing urgent confirmation that Yorktown was on the brink of collapse. Josiah felt the fragile structure of his newfound freedom tremble under the weight of that message, because surrender would not only redraw political boundaries, but determine whether he remained a free man or became property once again. The confirmation of surrender did not arrive with dramatic flourish, yet when word spread that British forces at Yorktown had laid down their arms, Josiah felt the strong re-hook of reality tighten around his throat, because the promise that had carried him across battlefields now hung by a thread thinner than smoke. Soldiers moved through the encampment in stunned silence, absorbing the magnitude of defeat. Officers attempted to maintain discipline, yet the certainty that once anchored their commands had evaporated, replaced by hurried discussions about evacuation and damage control. For black loyalists like Josiah, the news carried implications far beyond military loss, because their freedom had been tethered to the very army that had just conceded. Elijah listened carefully to conversations drifting from headquarters tents, piecing together fragments of information that painted an alarming picture. Negotiations were underway to formalize the end of hostilities, and colonial leaders were demanding the return of property seized or lost during the conflict. The word property echoed through Josiah's mind with brutal clarity, because he understood that many former slaveholders viewed escaped men not as soldiers who had fought honorably, but as assets to be reclaimed. The revolution that championed liberty threatened to tighten chains for those who had dared to believe British promises. British commanders faced a moral and logistical dilemma. Thousands of formerly enslaved people had sought refuge within their lines, and abandoning them to potential retaliation would expose the Crown's proclamation as hollow rhetoric.
Yet honoring commitments required ships, safe passage, and the political will to defy colonial demands. Josiah watched as clerks began compiling lists of black loyalists eligible for evacuation, documenting names, ages, and former owners in a ledger that mirrored the plantation records he had once feared. This time, however, the ink might determine whether he stepped onto a vessel bound for freedom or remained stranded in hostile territory. As preparations intensified, tension within the camp thickened. Rebel patrols hovered near British positions, aware that evacuation efforts were underway. Skirmishes erupted sporadically, each confrontation serving as a reminder that surrender had not erased animosity. Josiah felt the urgency of time pressing against him because departure windows were narrowing, and rumors suggested that not everyone would secure passage. Elijah urged him to remain vigilant and ready, emphasizing that hesitation could mean capture once British forces withdrew. One cold evening, Josiah stood near the harbor where ships awaited orders, their masts silhouetted against a darkening sky. The scent of salt and tar mingled with anxiety as families clustered together, clutching sparse belongings and fragile hope. He had gambled his life on a proclamation issued by a distant governor, and now that gamble hinged on whether imperial officials would defy rebel pressure to reclaim human property. As the first transport vessel prepared to depart under heavy guard, a commotion erupted along the dock. Colonial representatives were demanding inspection rights, insisting that escaped slaves be returned before any evacuation could proceed. Josiah felt the ground beneath him shift once more, because the decision unfolding in that harbor would determine whether his journey led toward lasting freedom or dragged him back into the shadow of the plantation he had risked everything to escape. As colonial representatives pressed forward on the dock, demanding the return of what they called stolen property, Josiah felt the strong re-hook of history tightening around the harbor like a noose, because the argument unfolding before him was not merely political, but deeply personal. Rebel officials insisted that the treaty terms required restitution, and they spoke with unwavering confidence that the revolution's victory entitled them to reclaim enslaved individuals who had fled to British protection. British commanders responded with restrained defiance, arguing that those who had answered Lord Dunmore's proclamation were not cargo, but loyal subjects who had risked their lives for the crown. The standoff threatened to paralyze the evacuation. Ships rocked gently in the harbor while armed guards lined the pier, their presence signaling that negotiations could fracture into violence at any moment. Amid this tension, British officers unveiled a measure intended to prevent chaos and preserve their pledge. They began compiling what would later be known as the Book of Negroes, a detailed registry listing every black loyalist authorized to depart. Each entry recorded a name, physical description, former owner, and destination, transforming individual stories into official documentation that could withstand colonial scrutiny. Josiah stood in line beneath a gray sky that seemed to mirror the uncertainty churning within him. When his turn arrived, a clerk dipped his quill into ink and asked for his name. The question struck him with unexpected force because the plantation had stripped him of his original identity and replaced it with a label chosen by a master. He hesitated before answering with the name he had carried since capture, aware that this ledger might determine whether he crossed the Atlantic as a free man or remained trapped in a land that had never recognized his humanity. The clerk recorded the information carefully, noting his age and stature, then marked him for passage to Nova Scotia alongside others deemed eligible for resettlement. Colonial representatives protested vehemently, arguing that the treaty defied the spirit of reconciliation. British officials countered that honor demanded protection for those who had served faithfully. Josiah listened as powerful men debated principles while the fate of thousands hinged on the outcome. The irony felt almost unbearable because liberty had been the rallying cry of the revolution, yet here, on the dock, it was being negotiated selectively.
Elijah's name appeared in the registry as well, though his injured shoulder limited his capacity for further military service. Together they waited as the first group boarded under heavy guard, each step onto the gangplank carrying the weight of finality. Josiah understood that leaving American shores would not erase trauma or guarantee prosperity, yet remaining would almost certainly invite re-enslavement under triumphant rebels eager to restore their economic order. As dusk settled and lanterns flickered against the water, word spread that space aboard the next vessel was limited and that colonial pressure was intensifying. Josiah felt urgency surge through him once more, because the harbor that symbolized escape could just as easily become a trap if negotiations collapsed before he stepped onto that ship. As lantern light flickered across the restless harbor and British officers hurried to finalize departure lists, Josiah felt the strong rehook of finality settle over him with a gravity that eclipsed even the fear of capture. The next transport vessel would sail before dawn, and his name had been confirmed within the registry that now stood between freedom and forced return. Colonial representatives still argued along the pier, insisting that reconciliation required the restoration of enslaved labor, yet British commanders remained firm in their refusal to surrender those who had fought under the Crown's banner. The tension hummed like a live wire stretched across the dock. When Josiah stepped onto the gangplank, he resisted the urge to look back, knowing that the shoreline behind him held both the worst memories of his life and the soil where he had bled in pursuit of liberty. Elijah followed closely, moving with measured caution as his injured shoulder stiffened in the cold night air. Around them, families clutched bundles of belongings that contained little more than spare clothing and fragile hope. Children pressed against their mothers, while elderly men leaned heavily on canes, all aware that this crossing would carry them away from a land that had promised freedom while practicing bondage. From the deck, Josiah finally allowed himself to glance toward the dark outline of the American coast. The plantation fields, the battlefield smoke, and the dockside confrontation blurred into a single haunting image. He understood that the revolution unfolding on that continent would be celebrated as a triumph of liberty, yet for thousands like him, it marked a complicated departure rather than a simple victory.
The same nation proclaiming independence had nearly reclaimed him as property, and that contradiction would linger long after the sails caught wind. As the ship eased away from the harbor, a hush fell over those gathered on deck. Some whispered prayers, others wept quietly, and many stared ahead into the vast Atlantic with expressions shaped by equal parts relief and apprehension. British sailors moved efficiently among the rigging, determined to avoid further interference from colonial patrols. Josiah felt the deck shift beneath his feet and recognized that the ocean now represented both refuge and uncertainty. Nova Scotia awaited them, a place rumored to offer land and opportunity, yet also known for harsh winters and unwelcoming terrain. Elijah rested beside the railing and spoke softly about resilience, reminding Josiah that survival had carried them from the plantation to the battlefield, and now to this vessel. Still, neither man could predict how they would be received in a distant northern colony struggling with its own challenges. The British Crown had honored its pledge by granting passage, but honor alone would not build homes or guarantee acceptance in unfamiliar soil. As the American coastline receded into darkness, Josiah sensed that another test loomed beyond the horizon.
Freedom had been secured on paper and sealed by departure, yet the true measure of liberty would begin only when they set foot in a new land where promises would once again confront reality. When the ship finally cut through thick Atlantic fog and anchored along the rugged coastline of Nova Scotia, Josiah felt the strong rehook of expectation collide with an unfamiliar reality, because freedom had carried him northward but offered no guarantees about what awaited on shore. The harbor appeared stark and unforgiving, framed by jagged rocks and dense forests that seemed untouched by the gentler climate he had known in the Carolinas. British officials stood ready to process arrivals with formal efficiency, yet their measured politeness could not conceal the uncertainty surrounding how thousands of black loyalists would integrate into a colony already strained by war's aftermath. Stepping onto the dock, Josiah inhaled air so sharp with cold that it burned his lungs. Snow clung stubbornly to the ground despite the advancing season, and the wind slicing across the harbor carried none of the warmth he associated with survival. He watched families huddled together as officials assigned plots of land based on the registry compiled months earlier. Promises of acreage and supplies had been circulated during evacuation, yet what many received were remote parcels carved from rocky terrain that demanded relentless labor before yielding sustenance.
Elijah studied the landscape with cautious determination, recognizing that this new chapter required endurance of a different kind. The brutality of overseers had been replaced by the indifference of climate and limited resources. Settlers already established in Nova Scotia viewed the influx of black loyalists with a mixture of curiosity and resentment, worried that scarce provisions would stretch thinner. Josiah sensed that prejudice had not vanished with the crossing of the ocean. It had merely shifted form, emerging now in subtle exclusions and unequal distribution of aid. The first weeks tested every ounce of resilience he possessed. Shelter consisted of crude structures hastily erected from timber and canvas, offering little protection against relentless winds. Food supplies dwindled quickly, and promised rations often arrived late or in smaller quantities than expected. British administrators insisted that land grants would eventually provide stability, yet clearing forested plots required tools and strength that many newly arrived families lacked after years of displacement and warfare. Despite these hardships, Josiah felt a quiet transformation unfolding within him. No overseer patrolled the tree line with a whip, and no master dictated the rhythm of his labor. Each swing of the axe against frozen wood carried a different meaning than harvesting cotton under threat of punishment. He worked not to satisfy an owner's ledger, but to carve out a future that belonged, at least in principle, to him. Elijah often reminded the community that liberty was not a destination reached in comfort, but a condition forged through perseverance. As winter deepened and supplies thinned further, whispers spread that some black loyalists were considering relocation once again, this time to Sierra Leone, where British officials hinted at the possibility of building a settlement governed by formerly enslaved people themselves. Josiah listened intently to those discussions because the land beneath his feet still felt temporary, and the question of where true belonging could be found remained painfully unresolved. The conversation about Sierra Leone began as a quiet murmur among weary settlers, yet for Josiah it carried the strong rehook of possibility that had followed him across every border since the night he fled the plantation. Nova Scotia had granted him legal freedom, but survival there demanded a relentless battle against frozen soil, limited provisions, and the persistent undercurrent of racial inequality that shaped daily life.
British officials had fulfilled their obligation by transporting black loyalists northward, yet the promises of land and stability often dissolved beneath bureaucratic delay and uneven distribution of resources.
Community gatherings grew more frequent as leaders debated whether remaining in Nova Scotia offered a viable future or whether relocation to West Africa might provide an opportunity to build something autonomous. Representatives from the Sierra Leone Company described a proposed settlement where formerly enslaved people could cultivate land under British protection while exercising a degree of self-governance. The proposal stirred complex emotions within Josiah because it invoked the continent from which he had been torn as a child, even though the village of his memory remained geographically and culturally distant from the coastal colony being advertised. Elijah approached the discussion with measured caution, reminding neighbors that imperial ventures were rarely driven by pure benevolence. He emphasized that while the Sierra Leone plan promised empowerment, it also served British economic interests, and relocating once again would require abandoning the fragile networks they had established in Nova Scotia. Josiah listened carefully, aware that every relocation in his life had been shaped by forces larger than his own will. The question confronting him now differed profoundly from the forced march to the river or the desperate crossing into British lines. This decision, though constrained by circumstance, offered a measure of agency. Winter storms battered the settlement with renewed intensity, reinforcing the hardships that fueled consideration of departure. Crops struggled in rocky soil, and supply shipments arrived inconsistently, leaving families dependent on shared reserves that dwindled faster than expected. Josiah felt the weight of responsibility toward those who looked to younger men for physical labor and communal leadership. He understood that leaving would not only alter his own trajectory, but influence the collective fate of neighbors who had survived bondage and war. One evening, as snow fell in heavy silence, Josiah stood beside Elijah overlooking the frozen harbor and spoke about the ache that had never fully subsided since his childhood capture. He confessed that part of him longed to step onto African soil once more, even if it meant confronting a landscape altered by time and colonial design. Elijah responded that belonging might not reside in geography alone, but in the community they forged wherever they settled.
Within days, officials announced that ships bound for Sierra Leone would soon depart for those willing to embark on yet another uncertain voyage. Josiah felt the familiar tension between risk and hope rise within him, because the next choice would determine whether his journey circled back toward ancestral shores or remained anchored in the cold land that had offered freedom without comfort. When the list of confirmed passengers for Sierra Leone was posted near the settlement's meeting hall, Josiah felt the strong re-hook of destiny tug at him with a force that echoed the night he crossed the Carolina River, because once again his name stood at the edge of departure. The decision had not been impulsive. Weeks of prayer, discussion, and reflection had shaped it. Nova Scotia had given him legal freedom, but little warmth, little prosperity, and even less assurance that his community would thrive under policies that often treated black loyalists as an afterthought. The opportunity to help establish a colony on African soil carried the promise of self-determination, even if it was framed within British oversight. Elijah chose to remain behind, his injury and advancing age binding him to the life he had begun carving from frozen ground. The farewell between them unfolded without dramatic display, yet the weight of shared history lingered in every word. Elijah reminded Josiah that survival had always required courage balanced with caution, and he urged him to approach the new venture with eyes open to both opportunity and manipulation. Josiah embraced him tightly, aware that this parting might be permanent, and carried that memory with him as he boarded the vessel bound for West Africa. The Atlantic crossing felt different from the first voyage of his life. This time he was not shackled beneath deck or reduced to cargo. He moved freely across the ship, conversing with fellow passengers about their hopes for building schools, churches, and farms independent of plantation hierarchies. Yet the ocean still held the echo of trauma, and nights on deck stirred fragmented memories of suffocating darkness and stolen childhood. Freedom had changed the conditions of the journey, but it could not erase the past. After weeks at sea, the coastline of Sierra Leone emerged through humid haze, lush and green in a way that contrasted sharply with Nova Scotia's austerity. Josiah felt an unfamiliar mixture of recognition and distance. Though this was not the village of his birth, the climate and landscape awakened dormant sensations within him, reminding him of rhythms once embedded in his earliest years. British officials greeted the settlers with structured plans for town layouts and agricultural development, emphasizing cooperation while maintaining clear lines of authority. The work of establishing the colony proved demanding from the outset. Clearing land, constructing shelters, and negotiating relationships with local communities required diplomacy and resilience. Disease threatened newcomers unaccustomed to the tropical environment, and supplies did not always arrive as promised. Still, Josiah sensed a profound shift in purpose. For the first time, he labored not under coercion or for imperial war efforts, but toward the creation of a society that might reflect the endurance and dignity of those who had survived unimaginable displacement. As the sun set over the new settlement, casting golden light across freshly cut timber and gathered families, Josiah recognized that the journey had not restored what slavery had stolen, yet it had delivered him to a place where his choices shaped the horizon ahead. Even so, he could not ignore the awareness that building freedom on contested soil would invite challenges that tested whether this final migration would secure lasting stability or ignite another struggle for survival. As the settlement in Sierra Leone began to take shape beneath relentless sun and seasonal rains, Josiah felt the strong re-hook of responsibility settle over him with greater intensity than any chain he had once worn. Because building freedom required more than escape, it demanded leadership, compromise, and endurance that extended beyond personal survival.
The early months exposed tensions that few had anticipated. British administrators insisted on structured governance aligned with imperial interests, while settlers who had endured slavery sought a community defined by collective voice rather than distant authority. The fragile balance between gratitude for protection and desire for autonomy shaped every council meeting. Josiah emerged as a respected figure among the settlers, not because he sought power, but because his life embodied the journey from bondage to self-determination. He helped mediate disputes over land allocation and encouraged cooperation with neighboring African communities whose presence predated the colony. He understood that sustainable peace required mutual respect rather than assumptions of entitlement. Yet misunderstandings occasionally escalated into conflict, fueled by cultural differences and suspicion rooted in centuries of exploitation that neither side could ignore. Disease swept through the settlement during the rainy season, testing morale and resilience. Several families mourned loved ones lost to fever, and grief threatened to unravel the fragile optimism that had accompanied arrival. Josiah assisted in organizing care for the sick, drawing upon lessons learned during harsh winters in Nova Scotia and chaotic days in British encampments. He recognized that liberty did not shield anyone from suffering, but it granted them the right to confront hardship without a master's whip dictating their pace. British officials continued pressing for agricultural output that would justify imperial investment, occasionally clashing with settlers who prioritized communal well-being over rapid expansion. Josiah found himself navigating conversations that echoed earlier contradictions in his life, where promises of opportunity were intertwined with expectations of obedience. He remained vigilant against any structure that resembled the plantation system he had escaped, determined that the colony would not replicate hierarchies rooted in coercion. One evening, as drums resonated softly across the settlement and children chased one another between newly built homes, Josiah reflected on the path that had carried him from a burning village to a plantation, from battlefield smoke to frozen shores, and now to African soil once more. The ache of loss still lingered, particularly the absence of his mother, whose fate remained unknown. Yet he sensed that honoring her memory required nurturing this community into something enduring. Rumors began circulating that external powers viewed the colony as strategically valuable, raising concerns that larger geopolitical interests might once again entangle the settlers in conflicts beyond their control. Josiah understood that vigilance would remain essential because history had taught him that freedom unguarded could erode quietly.
As night settled over the settlement and stars shimmered above the Atlantic horizon, he recognized that the final chapter of his journey would not be defined by escape alone, but by whether this fragile experiment in autonomy could withstand pressures gathering just beyond the shoreline. As rumors of foreign interest and political maneuvering drifted once more toward the fragile colony, Josiah felt the strong re-hook of history tightening in a way that reminded him of every turning point that had shaped his life, because he understood with painful clarity that freedom was never a permanent gift, but a condition that required constant defense. Sierra Leone had given him something no plantation or battlefield ever had, the authority to decide how his labor would shape his future. Yet he also knew that empires did not relinquish influence easily, and that even settlements founded by the formerly enslaved could become pawns in larger struggles. In the years that followed, Josiah devoted himself to building institutions that would outlast him. He worked alongside others to establish a school where children learned to read not only scripture, but the history of their own endurance. He insisted that the community record births, marriages, and deaths with deliberate care, because documentation meant visibility, and visibility resisted erasure. He often thought about the ledger on the plantation where his body had been reduced to a number, and contrasted it with the registry in Nova Scotia that had preserved his freedom. Now, in this settlement, records would serve not as tools of ownership, but as affirmations of existence. Despite progress, challenges persisted. Trade disputes emerged, leadership disagreements surfaced, and tensions occasionally flared with neighboring groups wary of British-backed expansion. Josiah navigated these obstacles with a steady resolve shaped by experience. He had survived the suffocating darkness of a slave ship, the calculated cruelty of plantation life, the smoke-filled uncertainty of revolution, and the biting cold of exile. Those memories fortified him against complacency, reminding him that liberty secured through struggle could not be sustained through neglect. One evening, long after the settlement had grown into a functioning town, Josiah stood at the shoreline where waves rolled steadily toward the coast. The Atlantic stretched before him, vast and indifferent, yet no longer a symbol of captivity. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember the riverbank of his childhood, the warmth of his mother's embrace, and the name she had whispered into his ear before violence shattered their world. For years that name had lived quietly within him, unspoken amid shifting identities imposed by masters and officers. Now, with no one left to claim ownership over his life, he spoke it aloud to the wind, reclaiming a piece of himself that slavery had failed to destroy. Josiah understood that his journey had not undone the crimes of an empire or erased the suffering endured by millions.
Yet it stood as testimony that survival could evolve into leadership and that stolen childhood could mature into purposeful legacy.
The nation he left behind would continue grappling with the contradictions of its founding, while this settlement would confront its own trials under watchful global eyes. Still, he found solace in knowing that his life had transcended the boundaries others once imposed. If this story of endurance, sacrifice, and the true cost of freedom moved you, subscribe to Canon of Darkness, because history holds countless untold journeys that shaped the world we know today, and every one of them deserves to be remembered.